So this classic CMG, again, you could put in D. They do D1 because they just assume the wheel is the biggest, and that's all they throw in there. There are other cross couplings, and so with the D, we would have all the cross couplings required to do that. I would do this one, it's just slightly more precise. And then you have, with the classic CMG, we hold the wheel speeds constant. So now I'm going from 2n control inputs just back to n. So a 4-wheel pyramid configuration gives me a one-dimensional null space. But you have 4 options on how to gimbal your wheels. And this is how you can then produce, well, which gimbal rates do I want? And the most popular answer is the minimum norm solution. And that inverse will have an infinity of answers because it's a 3x4, full rank, hopefully. And therefore you can solve for gamma dot, and that will be the smallest gamma dots that will produce this required attitude control. That makes sense? So, singularities occur when D1 is not full rank. If we go look at D1, and here's D1. You can see it's a bunch of scalars. Yes, your wheel speed could compensate for this, but that's really rare because the wheel speed would have to be extremely small or the spacecraft spin speed has to be extremely fast. So this is typically not 0. Then you would lose controllability there. The other part is everything's proportional to GT. So every wheel has a certain GS, GT, and GG. So this GT is here. And that's what produces the gyroscopic torque. So now I need at least 3 vectors that aren't collinear, and I can create any 3-dimensional vector. If you have 4, we have some wiggle room, right? But that's the GT, and that's what we're talking about here. So how is it possible that GTs would not span 3-dimensional space? Jessica, what do you think? Yeah, essentially, yes. So we've got typically in a pyramid, that's the gimbal axes are lined up such like this, that the gimbals are not collinear, they're all in unique directions. But then the GS-GTs are perpendicular to those gimbal axes. And the GT1 axis is here, and the GT axis over there could be here, and you can actually have all 4 GT axes lie in the same plane. If they lie in the same plane, what kind of torque can you generate? A 3-dimensional one? A 1-dimensional one? What torques can you generate when they're collinear like this? You can generate any torque that's inside that plane. But if your control says, yeah, but I want a torque outside of that plane, it's going to go, no, no can do. And if you could torque continuously once one outside that plane, it just goes, yeah, but you're not getting anything. Not today. And that's it. So you have all this math, all this stuff, and the output is 0. Just do nothing. And that's called gimbal lock, right? So I'm going to show you a 2D example of that as well. But that's the classic CMG singularity. We had only control authority in this math about this transverse axis. And because, as you say correctly, they are spinning around in the body, they can actually spin around and become coplanar. And that's a problem. Because then this D1 doesn't even span 3-dimensional space. And if you put it in your classic minimum norm inverse, there's a D1 transpose inverse in there that's supposedly a 3x3. It will only have rank 2. And you cannot even do that step without having a singularity. It's just not a good day. So how do we get around this? And there's a variety of papers, different approaches. People still publish on this, on classic CMGs and how to avoid these inverses or mitigate the impact of it. There are several problems. One of them was actually over here. If we say LR, I want a torque about here. And I'm just going, that's what I want. Ricardo, you're working on attitude guidance, right? And you can find quickly to go from A to B, there's a whole series of solutions. Do you go left around an obstacle, right around an obstacle? Do you do a straight line approach? Your control just says, I just want to go straight. That's what I want. And the gimbals are going, yeah, but I can't do that. And then that's it. The conversation ends and you're locked up and nothing happens. So you could also go, well, if that happens, why don't I just go a little bit left? And all of a sudden it works, right? If your required torque is not in this plane that all the GTs span, then they go, okay, I can give you some of that. If your torque isn't orthogonal to it, but something else, it'll give you at least that component. If your required torque is perfectly in that plane, you will go through that singularity without a hiccup. So there's options and things you could tune in the guidance actually to kind of go, okay, that's not a good one, so maybe I'm going a different way. And people do this often, like they pre-configure the CMGs before they do a maneuver. They look at where they're going to go, they pre-compute what's going to happen. If I just do my initial conditions, they're going to run through a singularity. But if I use my null space to kind of twist my CMGs around a little bit, and then I do the same maneuver, I don't hit a singularity. Because the LRs will be different. They all depend on my current configuration state. The LR had stuff in there with omega S, omega T, right? That's a function of my body rates and my current GS-GTs. So if I can shift them around a little bit differently, tweak them, I may not have that problem. So that's one of the things we could tweak with LR, but it's tricky as you can imagine, because you can't just run one control. All of a sudden you have to go, okay, instead of straight, just wobble a little bit left and then go right, and then we're going to get there. It gets a hell of a lot more complicated versus just get there. The other one is, how do we just brute force get through that singularity? And that's something proposed by Nakamura and Hanafusa. It's a very famous paper. If you do CMGs, you will often find this. This is how we're doing the singularity robust inverse. And basically, they look at the condition number of D1 times D1 transpose. It's a 3 by 3. It's supposed to have rank 3. Do you know what the condition number is? You take the singular values and you divide the largest singular value over the smallest. So if it's well conditioned, that's close to 1. And then MATLAB is really happy. And sometimes you see MATLAB yell at you, bad conditioning on this inverse. It's because one of those singular values, or eigenvalues of the matrix, becomes close to 0. It's an almost singular matrix, and that's a problem. And then that ratio becomes huge. So they look at that, and that's like the singularity index, and they go, okay, depending on that condition number, or how close are we to losing rank deficiency, I all of a sudden introduce an alpha. And you could do it through a Gaussian kind of a curve where it's 0 away from the singularity and then comes up to 1 or some number, or there's all kinds of ways. You can just make it something, 0 and then make it something and then back to 0. People do all kinds of tricks. But the difference is, if this becomes rank deficient, adding an identity with this number will all of a sudden brute force make it full rank. But you've really mathematically cheated. That's not the physics you were given. You just made the math like, just change this 2 to a 3. Nobody look, just change it to a 3 and it will work. That's essentially what you're doing. That means when you do this inverse times this, you will not have gimbal rates that produce LR, but it'll be something close to LR. And so with that little trick, you keep alpha kind of small and only as big as needed. You're kind of cheating, and essentially what it introduces is something effectively that changes the required torque and says, okay, if you wanted to go straight, but I'm giving you something different, then you will have a slight path deviation because you're getting the different torque. And that's essentially what we talked about earlier, changing the guidance. Instead of telling it to go left, it just goes, well, I'm just introducing an error and we will go left. And then the outer loop will recognize that and go, whoa, you've been left. So instead of going straight, you need to also go a little bit right again. And that helps you get around. So it gets around the singularity. The problems arise with this if you want to have perfect tracking. So you want this attitude motion, not just because I'm going from A to B, but I want to keep talking at Boulder or looking at the star as I am doing some motion. And you can do that, but then if here all of a sudden there's a singularity, you're going to go, whoa, I'm a little bit drunk, I'm going back again, oh, I'm fine again, That's what will happen. So if you have to have good tracking throughout the maneuver, this is not going to give it to you. It cannot give it to you because we lose controllability. That makes sense? Okay. We are, 1 minute over, so it's going to stop recording. Anyway, we'll talk more about these singularities next time, and then break this up into something we want to control both the wheel speeds and that, and why that is a good thing, what we can do with that, how do we take advantage of it, and there's lots of wiggle room, things to look at. See you next week.